Hi, we're on to Module 3, Lesson 1, Justifications for Population Control. And what better place to discuss this subject than Dracula's castle as the backdrop? Broadly speaking, population concerns and the methods used to address them have gone through three distinct justifications, each rooted in its own historical period and circumstances. First, we have the civilizing the savages justification and racial superiority, which went on from about 1850 to 1945. And then we have national security and international peace from 1945 to 1985. And then, most recently, environmental conservation and sustainable development, which, let's say, started in 1985 and it is ongoing. The first justification, that of civilizing the savages and racial superiority. During the tail end of the colonial era, European powers justified their plunder of lands not their own and the murder of people unlike themselves with the excuse that they were civilizing the savages by bringing them the benefits of European culture and Western technology. That European arrogance and sense of entitlement, which originated in the British Empire and flourished during the Industrial Revolution, decayed into delusions of racial superiority that found political and popular support in every Western country, with colonies to abuse. Europe's racial superiority conceit reached their apex in the Nazi and fascist ideology and ended in the depredations of the Second World War and the Holocaust. What began as the white man's burden and ostensibly as a project to advance civilization evolved into a demented belief in the racial superiority of Caucasians and the self-serving science of eugenics, which was used to morally justify the genocide of Jews and Gypsies throughout Europe and the ethnic cleansing of countless indigenous people throughout Asia, Africa, Australia, and the Americas. Three historical figures define the transition from theoretical concern over population growth to active ethnic cleansing. First, we have Thomas Robert Malthus, who lived from 1766 to 1834, then Sir Francis Galton, 1822 to 1911, and last, Adolf Hitler, who lived from 1889 to 1945. In 1789, Malthus published an essay on the principle of population, showing that population growth outpaces agricultural production and traps humanity into subsistence-level conditions. His analysis was particularly relevant at a time when the Industrial Revolution had precipitated a population explosion in Britain, and poverty made life unbearable for increasingly more people. In 1883, Francis Galton, who was inspired by Darwin's theory of evolution, invented eugenics, and in his book, Inquiries into Human Faculty and Its Development, advocated for monetary incentives to promote the breeding of intelligent people as a form of social selection of desirable traits. The notion that humanity can be improved by deliberate social programs and government intervention took hold and spread throughout the Western world, where it was soon misappropriated to justify the forced sterilization of mentally retarded and mentally ill people, as well as the brutal assimilation and integration of indigenous people throughout the British Empire, so as to destroy their cultures and wean their numbers. Fascism, being a form of radical authoritarian nationalism, took the notion of racial superiority that had evolved out of eugenics to its ultimate conclusion, namely mass murder, by asserting that stronger nations have the right to expand their territory by displacing weaker nations. And the foremost proponent of racial supremacist views was, of course, Adolf Hitler, who used German superiority claims to justify his final solution and pursue the systematic extermination of Jews and Gypsies, as well as his policy of conquest and occupation that had as its objective a German hegemony over Europe, and especially what he considered the inferior Slavic people of Eastern Europe. The second justification, that of national security and international peace, went on from 1945 to about 1985. To avoid repeating the massacres of the two world wars, which occurred within 4 decades that experienced the fastest population growth in Europe's history, and the frightening prospect of nuclear annihilation, world leaders agreed at the end of World War II henceforth to uphold peace among nations through mutual cooperation and proactive measures. Recent history had taught nations the hard lesson that war is caused by lack of natural resources when nations outgrow them in their quest for progress and prosperity, and that war can therefore be avoided if nations learn to live within their means by properly managing their natural resources. It was also understood that the only way to avoid outgrowing natural resources is by limiting population growth, this being the only alternative to war. The rationale for controlling population was therefore supplied by the real fear of nuclear conflict and the need to avoid it, by living within one's national means. Safeguarding natural resources became the primary national security prerogative of every industrialized nation on earth, and safeguarding peace among nations became the primary imperative of the international system and the international community, which was empowered to combat population growth across the world before it leads to wars of necessity. The United Nations was formed to fulfill the task of keeping the peace between nations by controlling population growth within nations. The new world order revolves around the objective to maintain peace by controlling population growth. The requisite shift in thinking in terms of what is good for the world rather than just what is good for a single nation is primarily the accomplishment of the United States. It is a paradigm shift that has propelled the world towards enlightened cooperation, continuous dialogue, and economic interdependence. The United States has promoted this paradigm shift with extraordinary self-restraint and laudable selflessness, considering the potential for abuse and the sacrifices that have been required of it. While the civilian institutional infrastructure was put in place at the United Nations and its agencies to be able to coordinate this colossal global task, the military forces and intelligence agencies of the US, UK, and the USSR, the 3 allied powers that won the war, assumed command and control of the depopulation agenda and pioneered the covert chemical sterilization methods that are still with us today. However cruel and underhanded we may find their population control measures to be today, they are certainly a far cry from the atrocities of conventional war endured by our grandparents, and infinitely more humane than the annihilating power of a thermonuclear explosion. Compared to the wanton destruction of war, proactively combating human fertility by mutual agreement, or should that fail, by mutual coercion, also has the distinct advantage of sparing the physical infrastructure and ensuring uninterrupted economic progress. The global depopulation policy, therefore, represents a giant leap forward in the way nations conduct themselves towards other nations, in the way people coexist within and beyond national borders, and in the way natural resources are managed and shared, and to what purpose they are being used. Population control as a substitute to war is the progeny of the bipolar world order that followed World War II, when the international balance of power was precariously held by the United States and the Soviet Union. Considering the deep suspicions and ideological animosities between the communist and capitalist camps, and the existential threat they pose to one another through the awesome power of the nuclear warheads they had pointing at each other, it should come as no surprise that they agreed to wage a demographic war on their own people and on those within their spheres of influence, rather than risk their mutual assured destruction in a nuclear confrontation. American President Franklin D. Roosevelt was the moving force behind the formation of the United Nations organization, and the ideals he cherished are embedded in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. As an ardent anti-imperialist and free trader, Roosevelt envisioned a world free of European colonialism and stated his post-war goals in the Atlantic Charter, the policy statement agreed upon by the Allies in 1941, whose pillars are the abandonment of the use of force and of ambitions for territorial aggrandizement, global cooperation to secure a better economic and social conditions for all, freedom from fear and want, and free trade and free access to raw materials. In 1942, the Allies pledged adherence to the Charter's principles, and in 1945 at Yalta, just before war's end, Roosevelt brought Stalin on board and reiterated his vision of the future and his intentions for enduring peace. He said, and I quote, "The Crimean Conference ought to spell the end of a system of unilateral action, the exclusive alliances, the spheres of influence, the balances of power, and all the other expedients that have been tried for centuries and have always failed. We propose to substitute for all these a universal organization in which all peace-loving nations will finally have a chance to join." End of quote. The United Nations was born from enlightened minds and was endowed from the beginning with the noblest intentions. But even the noblest intentions are sullied by the realities of the day, and the post-war generation had the most desperate realities to contend with, both political and economic. It was no time for consensus building. The entire world was on America's shoulders at war's end, and America moved in on Europe and Japan with military ruthlessness to ensure that history does not repeat itself and aggressor nations are contained once and for all. The reconstruction of Europe and Japan comprised ambitious population control objectives in addition to demilitarization, and they were achieved in record time and were mirrored by the Soviets in their own sphere of influence and with even greater ruthlessness. Once the world's industrial nations were tamed with fluoride and tough love within 20 years of war's end, the U.S. focused on Latin America. Since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823, the Western Hemisphere had been America's concern. The depopulation project had in the meantime passed into the hands of a new generation that was led with unprecedented fervor by Nelson and David Rockefeller, Richard Nixon and Henry Kissinger. By 1980, every country in Latin America, save for Bolivia, Paraguay, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Haiti, had adopted the same covert methods of chemical sterilization as the West had done before them. The depopulation project had become global, and its globalization was firmly entrenched in America's foreign policy statements under the cover of security. The third justification is that of environmental conservation and sustainable development, and it is the most recent one, having started around 1985. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the lifting of the Iron Curtain, and the gradual absorption of formerly communist nations into the European Union, the threat of nuclear confrontation disappeared, and the justification for depopulation shifted from national security and international peace to environmental preservation. Avoiding ecological collapse and preserving natural resources for future generations is a genuine concern that has traction with people outside the political and military arenas, which is why consensus building on the need for depopulation has become easier than ever before, and has brought on board environmentalists, scientists, religious leaders, celebrities, jurists, businessmen, journalists, and people from all walks of life. What demographers and world leaders saw 7 decades ago is now obvious to anyone willing to look at the world from a global perspective and capable of honesty. That is why the global depopulation policy has passed from the hands of a few enlightened leaders into the hands of civil society and a much broader international community. While many of the newcomers are unaware that covert chemical and biological sterilization agents are responsible for lower birth rates and stable populations in the developed world, and not prosperity and education as it is being asserted in order to deceive the public, others know but are unwilling to admit it openly, and some even to themselves, lest they should have to confront their consciences and the unpleasant reality that by their silence they are complicit in crimes against humanity and genocide. This is an inconvenient truth. It is far easier and far more to their advantage to go with the flow and benefit from joining the system already in place, rather than attempt to bring the con into the open so as to change the methodology of the global depopulation policy from covert, immoral, and involuntary poisoning to overt, ethical, and consensual legislation. And so we forge ahead towards our own self-destruction because the best among us lack the courage to stand up and speak the truth, to go against the grain, and because they have long stopped trusting in their fellow man and in their own ability to challenge the status quo. In a society where every man is for himself, every man cares only for himself. In a world of giant institutions, the individual has become an insignificant speck of dust. The institutional machinery was set in motion several decades ago and has gathered such momentum that even those at the helm of the international community are powerless to stop it. Perhaps the most influential figure in the transition to an environmental justification for population control, and the last individual to be heard before the UN and its agencies have completely institutionalized the population problem and drowned everyone in the bureaucracy, is American biologist Paul Ralph Ehrlich, who in 1968 published his influential book, The Population Bomb. Ehrlich predicted that the human population is too large and poses a threat to the environment of the planet and ultimately to human survival unless strong actions are taken to curb population growth and avert future ecological and social disasters. In 1983, the UN spun a satellite organization called the World Commission on Environment and Development, or more commonly known as the Brundtland Commission, to focus on environmental problems and solutions. The Brundtland report, published in 1987, came up with a course of action to avoid the dire predictions of environmental catastrophe. Its prescriptions are encapsulated in the term sustainable development, which has become the catchword for the environmental movement and the euphemism behind which depopulation measures have hidden ever since. The report's analysis and prescriptions are extraordinarily important and valuable, and it is not my intention to throw it into a negative light. My only criticism is that it does not bring the global depopulation policy out into the open, but rather hides it behind a new curtain, that of sustainable development. The Brundtland report was followed by Agenda 21, a non-binding, voluntarily implemented action plan with respect to sustainable development that was developed by the United Nations, multilateral organizations, and national governments at the Earth Summit in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 to combat poverty and pollution, conserve natural resources, and develop in a sustainable manner. The voluntary objectives of Agenda 21 were made enforceable in 2000 by the Millennium Development Goals, when 189 UN member states and 23 international organizations pledged: 1. To eradicate extreme poverty and hunger, 2. To achieve universal primary education, 3. To promote gender equality and empower women, 4. To reduce child mortality rates, 5. To improve maternal health, 6. To combat HIV/AIDS, malaria and other diseases, 7. To ensure environmental sustainability, and 8. To develop a global partnership for development, all of which hinge on one thing only: halting population growth and reducing the global population. The Millennium Development Goals are a concrete roadmap that sets specific targets and shows how to achieve them. It is an ambitious and worthy plan. But just like Agenda 21, it is dishonest because it refuses to state the obvious, namely that at its core lays the global depopulation policy. And that is how, over the course of a century and a half, the justification for population control measures has evolved from civilizing the savages to preserving international peace to safeguarding the environment. Last but not least, I would like to look at secular and religious justifications. Shall we call them secondary? Evil is opportunistic, and it has raised its ugly head by taking advantage of both our strengths and weaknesses. Neither the secular nor the religious sections of our society have been able to avoid falling victim to this new and most awesome incarnation of evil, and from being used by it. It has turned on us our respect for individual freedom, our democratic system of governance, our sense of right and wrong, our religious tenets, our deepest values and most cherished beliefs. And it has used and worsened our greed and egotism, our lack of trust in our others, our ethnic divisions, our religious differences, our smallness in the world, our conceits and ignorance. Secular leaders have chosen the easy comforts of realpolitik and have taken refuge from the hard task of having to confront and compel the masses by hiding behind practical and material considerations, by doing what needs to be done with the least resistance. They find it easier to lie to the masses than to educate them. They find it easier to tell people what they want to hear rather than what they need to know. But there is no benefit for politicians, scientists, and technocrats in empowering the people to do what is best for themselves on their own. Politicians across party lines, within nation-states, have joined hands with leaders of all colors across the world in agreement that population control measures are inevitable. They have been able to reach consensus and work in tandem, but it has not dawned on them to ask for their people's cooperation. It has not dawned on them that if they found sufficient ground to be able to agree, then so would the people of the world. That realization is inconvenient because it makes the hierarchical structures of global governance obsolete and dethrones leaders from their privileged positions of power. Maintaining and entrenching power is more important for political leaders than empowering their people. And that is why secular leaders, be they politicians, scientists, soldiers, or journalists, have placed their own best interest before the common good. Religious leaders have put up a good fight until the late 60s, when even the Vatican was absorbed into the rank and file of the depopulation elite. Beleaguered by traditionalist Catholics who refuted the Vatican's attempt to realign itself with the modern world through the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, which took place 1962 to 1965, Pope Paul VI issued the encyclical letter Humanae Vitae, Human Life, which spells out the Church's position on the regulation of birth, and subtly gives secular authorities permission to impair people's fertility, while in the same breath reaffirms the Church's opposition to artificial birth control methods, sterilization, and abortion. In this encyclical letter, Pope Paul VI wrote, and I quote, "The Church does not consider at all illicit the use of those therapeutic means necessary to cure bodily diseases, even if a foreseeable impediment to procreation should result therefrom, provided such impediment is not directly intended for any motive whatsoever." End of quote. Caught between a rock and a hard place, that is to say, on the one hand, between the immutable position of the Church on the issue of birth control due to the doctrine of papal infallibility, and the intractability of conservative Catholic members who refuse to accept a softening of Vatican's opposition to birth control, and on the other hand, the absolute necessity for population control in an overflowing world and the changing attitudes of the majority of Catholics towards the use of artificial birth control, the Vatican was forced to morally compromise by giving secular authorities the Church's blessing for the use of covert chemical sterilization methods, and its tacit collaboration as far as keeping these methods secret. While the Vatican has continued to openly criticize governments for allowing abortions, it has kept quiet about the chemical and biological methods used by governments to prevent births and to lower fertility, and that cause untold illness and constitute an affront to God and nature by degrading the intellectual and genetic endowment of humanity. To hold this compromised and dangerous position from the top, the church leaders who are responsible for changing the Holy See's position with respect to population control at the Second Vatican Council have been elected pontiffs. Cardinal Giovanni Battista Montini became Pope Paul VI. Bishop Albino Luciani became Pope John Paul I. Bishop Karol Wojtyla became Pope John Paul II, and Father Joseph Ratzinger, who was at the time a theological consultant, became Pope Benedict XVI. It remains to be seen if Pope Francis will break rank with the depopulation lobby and will protect the people by speaking up. I can only hope that he was elected for this very purpose, and that his predecessor was the first pope in 600 years to be ousted from office, not resign. Because church leaders finally realized that they made a fatal mistake by making the church a silent partner in the depopulation genocide. As the first Jesuit pope, the first Latin American, and former provincial superior of the Society of Jesus in Argentina, he may be the right man for the job. I say this because the Jesuits have been crucial in the development of liberation theology, which was the primary Catholic movement fighting for the defense of the poor in Latin America from unjust economic, political, and social conditions. That movement was sadly dismantled by the Vatican hierarchy to comply with the interests of the world's secular powers. It is now time to reconstitute it. Pope Francis shows signs that he is indeed the right man for the job, as he has initiated a reassessment of the Church's doctrine on birth control, as expressed in the encyclical letter Humanae Vitae. And on October 17, he has also publicly stated that population control is, I quote, a false solution, thus confirming the existence of the global depopulation policy and signaling a change of direction, if not yet policy, away from genocide.